David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We have new job numbers, and they're pretty ugly, quite frankly. So before the start of the coronavirus pandemic, the U.S. had about 158 million people working. Now, you probably have heard Republicans bragging about how more people were working before the coronavirus pandemic than ever before. And that's true, but also more people were not working before the coronavirus pandemic than ever before. This is a very popular political football that I want to remind you of before we move on to the data, which is the U.S. population grows. So if you have roughly the same portion of the population working and not working, at almost any point in time, you can accurately say we have more people than ever working, or you can accurately say we have more people than ever not working. Both are often true because the population keeps getting bigger. When it's a Democratic president, the Republicans focus on the number of people not working. When it's a Republican president, they focus on the number of people working. It's a meaningless statistic absent population growth sort of rates. And that is where that talking point comes from. But needless to say, 158 million people were working prior to the start of the coronavirus pandemic. We now have a total of at least 22.3 million people who have lost their jobs. Today, we learned that another 5.25 million people filed for unemployment benefits last week. We get the data on a 1-week delay. So today we learned about the numbers from last week. This brings the total to about 21 million people who have filed for unemployment benefits since the start of the coronavirus pandemic. This is 13% of the working population that have lost their jobs. And the real number is even higher. And what I mean by that is there are systems at the state level for filing for unemployment benefits that are over the max. They are stretched. They are overwhelmed. Phone systems where it's just busy. They can't even put you in the hold queue. Web systems that are just crashing because of the number of people trying to file benefits. So this is the number of people that have been able to file benefits. You've got all the people who have tried but failed. You also have people working in under-the-table jobs who do not qualify for unemployment benefits traditionally, even if exceptions have been made so that they do. In this particular case, many of them don't know it, and they've simply lost their jobs and not even filed. So the real rate is much higher. Now, we have a situation where the unemployment rate, as we typically see it, this is called the U3 rate. It's going to be almost useless very soon, and I'll explain why. The U3 is going to go up because tens of millions of people have lost their jobs. But it's likely to go up only a fraction of the sort of real unemployment rate for this reason, and it's counterintuitive. You might think, if 13% of the workforce lost its job, how is it that the unemployment rate might only go from like 4 to 6 or 4 to 7%? It doesn't make sense. The way our system works, the U3, which is that rate that is publicized, though it's 3.8, it's 4.2. When you aren't looking for work, you are no longer considered unemployed from the purposes of the unemployment rate. This has always been the case. And, during Obama, as usual, as the unemployment rate went down, you had Republicans say, the system is bogus. If you stop looking for work, you're no longer considered unemployed. That's been the case for decades. So again, it's another distraction technique that the right loves to use. But in this particular very special situation, there are going to be millions of people who have just lost their jobs who are not looking for work, because normally when you file for benefits, you have a questionnaire to fill out, or you might be doing it online. You might be answering it on the phone, and you are asked, are you looking for work? Have you interviewed anywhere for work? Give us a list of where you have, and you need to do that in order to get benefits. If you don't say that you're doing that, you don't get the benefits. Because so many of the current job losses are pandemic-related job losses, that is not required. You are not required to be looking for work. You're only required to be keeping in touch with your employer. So this could create a very confusing situation where despite 22 million people, 21 million people losing their jobs, we may only see a couple point uptick in the official unemployment rate because that's the way the unemployment rate is calculated. Republicans would complain about this during Obama's term. They'd say the economy is much worse than the rate tells you because all these people are so sick of looking for work in this terrible Obama economy, which wasn't true, that they've stopped looking. And so really the U3 is inaccurately low. That's true, but that's always the case. Here, this really matters because you are not required to be looking for work to receive unemployment benefits. And then there's the issue of the real number is way higher. Overwhelmed unemployment systems, as I mentioned, people trying to file claims but unable to, people who have lost jobs where they traditionally don't get unemployment benefits. So the true number, sadly, is way higher than 21 million people. Now, in real terms, how many of these 21 million jobs are going to reappear as the pandemic starts to fade? The answer is we don't know. Number one, when we talk about the pandemic fading, there's not going to be one day where we flip a switch. It's going to be a process. It's a process that could take up to 18 months in some ways, shapes, or forms. One report said for restaurants, for example, July is going to be the limit for a lot of restaurants, at which point many restaurant owners will just start walking away from their leases and not planning to reopen. Really, really sad, because yesterday was the record death rate, number of deaths, rather, in both the United States and globally. So we are not exactly at a time where we should be planning to reopen, despite Donald Trump announcing yesterday that today he would give a list of states that he wants to see reopen right away. One other data point, just out of curiosity, we did a survey of our own audience and we asked, has your income decreased due to coronavirus? Almost 2/3 of our audience says their income is the same or higher during the virus. 11% saw their income decrease anywhere from 10 to 30%. 9% said their income is down 40 to 70%. 3% said their income is down 80 to 90%. But 14% of our viewers and listeners say their income dropped to zero. Notice that 14% of our audience has lost all their income. It looks like 13% of the workforce nationally has gone on unemployment benefits. So very similar numbers, numbers tracking very similarly there. So we've got a big uphill battle to get back to where we were. Industries may change. Discussions of nationalizing certain supply chains are already starting, whether it's masks or medical equipment or whatever because of the virus. Anybody pretending to know what the economic landscape is going to look like in 18 months is simply guessing. And we need to understand that. We need to sit with the uncertainty because we really don't have another choice. There are two Republican Senate races for 2020 that we've been paying very close attention to. And in both of those races, Republican incumbents are in bigger and bigger trouble every single week. And it is delightful news. There's so much bad news going around right now. Bad economic news, bad health news, bad news about the laughable nature of American leadership, the presidency seen as a global laughingstock around the world. This is good news. I'm talking about Arizona and Maine. I'll tell you about both of them, starting with Arizona. In Arizona, Martha McSally is the junior senator. She has never been elected. She was appointed to serve out the remainder of the late Republican Senator John McCain's seat. She's horrible. I mean, truly horrible. She now wants to be elected for a full term. She's running against her, rather, is astronaut Mark Kelly. Mark Kelly is the brother of astronaut Scott Kelly. Scott's been a guest on this program. Very interesting conversation. Mark Kelly is also the husband of former Democratic Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, who was tragically shot years ago. You may remember the story. And Mark Kelly would be a tremendously good replacement for Martha McSally. And McSally isn't doing well, and I take great pleasure in that. In the latest poll, Mark Kelly is ahead of Martha McSally by 9 points. This is huge. It's hugely important for the 2020 balance of Senate power, which we've been talking about, because if Democrats are going to take over control of the Senate in November, and it's a very uphill battle, winning this seat back is essentially a necessity. Then we go to the state of Maine. In Maine, we have our old friend, the perennially disappointed Republican Senator Susan Collins. She has a serious opponent, and that opponent is Democrat Sara Gideon. Susan Collins was first elected in 1996. She's had pretty easy re-elections every 6 years, in 2002, in 2008, and in 2014. And she is sort of known for, this is not a great thing to be known for, but she's known for acting like she might take a stand against her own party, against the Republican Party. But then in the end, she always falls in line. You might remember that she was very disappointed with Brett Kavanaugh, but then voted to confirm him to the Supreme Court. She was very disappointed with Donald Trump's actions with Ukraine, but voted to acquit him in Trump's impeachment trial months ago, even though it feels like that was years ago. So it is very much long overdue for Susan Collins to go bye-bye. Sara Gideon is trying. The latest poll is old now. It's from March, but it has Gideon 4 points ahead, very tight. But heading into her last reelection, Susan Collins had pretty high approval ratings, as high as 69% in 2014. Susan Collins' latest approval rating is 37%. Okay? Susan Collins was reelected in 2014 with a 69% approval rating. Her approval rating is now 39%. This is very bad news for Susan Collins. It's very good news for Sara Gideon. But both of these races are going to be fights. So we can't take anything for granted. The reason I'm telling you this is not so we can all sit back and say, hey, we've got two of these that we're going to take over. Why I'm telling you this is to get you involved as you think about phone banking. If we remain stuck at home for the foreseeable future, these are two great races where you could get involved. Now, I know some of you are going to write to me and you're going to say, David, you centrist shill. Neither Sara Gideon nor Mark Kelly are uber progressive Bernie Sanders types. That's true. But we're talking about removing some really toxic Republicans here. We should all be fighting hard for that. Neither Mark Kelly nor Sara Gideon are as left as Bernie Sanders, but they are orders of magnitude better than what we have there right now. And it's going to be either McSally or Kelly, right? That's it. It's either going to be Susan Collins or Sara Gideon. Those are the choices. And defeating these two would be +2 for Democrats in the Senate. We're going to lose Alabama. Right now, former Senator and former Attorney General Jeff Sessions is running against Doug Jones. Remember, Doug Jones won against in a special election against a serial accused sex assaulter, predator. I don't know what word you want to apply to him. And now Jeff Sessions wants his seat back. Jeff Sessions is winning by 13 in the latest polls. We will almost certainly lose that seat. So we need these two just to get +1. Very important. Consider phone banking there. We'll talk about other important races upcoming. Make sure you're following me on Twitter at dpakman. Let me know how the quarantine is going for you, or if you've unilaterally decided to end your quarantine. I would want to hear that as well. I'm dpakman on Twitter. Quick break, back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are Gregory Lassen and Guido Franz. Guido Franz. Also want to say thanks to today's longtime sustaining member of the day. That's Don Norrie, who's been with us almost 5 years. I won't take up any more of our precious time together today with this, other than to say, grab a membership yourself at joinpakman.com. The level of discussion on the David Pakman Show Reddit lately has been very, very high. And I mean a lot high, to quote our president. Join the discussion at davidpakman.com/Reddit. A user named JP Dinsies posted a very interesting comparison of the policies of Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, and Donald Trump to try to make clear that there is really not very much in common between Biden and Trump, and quite a bit in common between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. And I think it's important for us to understand. I mean, listen, I don't think it's useful to pretend that Joe Biden is something he isn't. And that applies to both sides. Joe Biden is not Bernie Sanders. Joe Biden is not a progressive. Joe Biden is not going to push for nearly every policy that Bernie Sanders was pushing for. But Joe Biden is way closer to Bernie than he is to Donald Trump. And whether you look at the minimum wage, paid family leave, Citizens United, the death penalty, prison sentencing related to drugs, abortion rights, capital gains taxes, wealth taxes, the climate, nuclear power, you actually see that Bernie and Trump are both no's, sort of, and Biden is a yes. So in any case, that's not bragging about Biden's position. But the point is, if we say Biden's more like Trump than Bernie, we are just very, very wrong. I want people deciding on the facts. If you think that we are better off with Trump than Biden, then vote that way. But don't be tricked into making a move that helps Trump because you incorrectly believe that Biden and Trump share significant policy, when really the vast majority of the shared policy is between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, to different degrees on many issues. Decide however you want, but I want you to decide with the facts, not with incorrect talking points. So a very good post by JP Dinsies. El Bonzano posted, is David overusing the word weaponized? And a lot of people in the responses saying, this seems like a weird thing to be concerned about, and it's an appropriate word to be using. Yeah, my use of the word weaponized has definitely increased lately because we are seeing so much weaponization by the government. Donald Trump has weaponized disinformation. Donald Trump has weaponized his delusions of grandeur. Donald Trump has weaponized his own and his followers' ignorance and gullibility. We are seeing a level of weaponization, both by Donald Trump and by right-wing media that carries water for him, that is like nothing I've ever seen. And I was actually watching, I went on YouTube and I found some clips of Fox News covering George W. Bush's presidency. And of course, you know, it's the normal playbook. How do you support a standard Republican president if you are standard right-wing media? And it almost seemed quaint compared to the degree of weaponization that we are seeing today. It's not a defense of George W. Bush, and it's not a defense of Fox News. It is merely a shocking realization I came to of how far things have slid since the George W. Bush Fox News era to the Trump Fox News OAN phase in which we now find ourselves. Lastly, user Turkey Bacon and Cheese posted to the Reddit, Pedro call appreciation, writing, I just want to say that the Pedro part of the show was hilarious, a nice change in mood, and worth the time he wasted. Thanks for the laugh. Yeah, I got an email from someone claiming to be Pedro over the weekend with what they claimed was a picture of them. And it was just a drawing of a completely stereotypical Mexican man. And it struck me as incredibly offensive to some degree, and also hilarious because Pedro claims to be Colombian, but the drawing was of what you would see as a stereotypical Mexican, like mariachi guy. It's crazy. The entire Pedro arc is taking on a life of its own, but I'm glad people are getting some enjoyment out of it in these otherwise very dark times. Join the discussion at davidpakman.com/Reddit. Okay, you are not going to hear me say at any point during the next 6.5 months, which is the lead up to the November presidential election, you are not going to hear me say, Joe Biden's got this. I'm just not going to do it for two reasons. Number one, I actually believe it's going to be a fight to the end. And I think there's a very good chance Donald Trump ends up getting himself reelected. But I'm also not going to say it because I don't want to risk a single person hearing me say something like that and deciding that Joe doesn't need their vote and they can stay home or vote third party or whatever the case may be. There is a path to Trump's reelection that includes the effects of coronavirus on Democratic turnout, combined with Trump successfully using the virus to bamboozle and goad his base into thinking he did a great job with the virus, plus Trump doing just enough to keep the stock market buoyed, I think is the term I would use, so that it kind of looks like the economy is okay, even though it's imploding. But I also am not going to hide the polling from you. So that's why I want to talk today. We have national polls that look good for Biden. We have state polls that look very, very mixed for Joe Biden. So let's look at some examples, starting with the general election. In the general election hypothetical polls, Joe Biden is currently winning by an average of 5.5 points. Now, this ranges in a tie on Fox News, in Fox News' latest poll, all the way up to Biden leading by 11 in a recent CNN poll, and everything in between. And the average is that Biden is up 5.5. Now, let's think about 2016. In 2016, the national polling average going into the election was Hillary up 3.3, and Hillary ended up winning nationally by 2.1. So the polls were close. They were off by about a point in terms of the national popular vote. Of course, we have an electoral college system, and despite losing the popular vote badly, Donald Trump won the electoral college. Now, currently, Joe Biden, at 5.5 points ahead, has a much bigger lead than Hillary Clinton did going into the 2020 election. But remember, the electoral college system still would allow Donald Trump to win, even if he lost the popular vote by, 5.5 points would be a stretch. But if Biden wins the popular vote by 4, it's still very possible that Donald Trump could win the electoral college. It would be tough, but it would be doable. So now let's look at some individual states. North Carolina is not looking great for Joe Biden. There's a recent North Carolina poll where Trump is 7 points ahead of Joe Biden. Back in 2016, Trump won North Carolina by only 3. If Trump doubles his margin of victory in North Carolina from 2016 to 2020, it's a signal of very bad things for Joe Biden. But then we've got some places where it's looking very bad for Donald Trump. Arizona is one example. We talked earlier in the show how Republican incumbent Senator Martha McSally is losing by 9 to Democratic Senate challenger Mark Kelly. Well, Joe Biden is winning by an average of 4.4 and by as much as 9 in one poll in Arizona. That's a state Trump won in 2016. If Arizona goes from Trump winning by 4 to Biden winning by 4, that's an 8-point swing. And it's very, very bad for Donald Trump. Virginia is another example. Right now in Virginia, Biden's winning by an average of 7 and by as much as 10 in the latest poll. Hillary only won by 5 in 2016. So again, if Virginia goes from Hillary plus 5 to Biden plus 7, 8, or 9, or even 10, that is very bad for Trump. So what's the takeaway? The takeaway is, no matter what the polls say, go and vote. Ask for an absentee ballot if that's what your state is doing. Do not sit this one out because it is likely to be a huge fight. I was talking over the weekend on Zoom with a few friends who are very much journalists, writers, etc. Many of them feel that November is going to be a blowout. They just don't know who's going to win. The idea being it won't be close. Either Biden will very much pull away with it or Trump will very much pull away with it based on what's going on with coronavirus and the economy. If that's the case, then we're going to have to fight very, very hard for it to be Biden, for Biden to be the one who pulls away. Of course, predictions are often wrong, and it may well be close, and it may come down to just a couple of states. So it will be a huge fight. Anything that makes you think we've got this is very dangerous thinking, and I would encourage you to disabuse yourself of those notions. Do not get confident. They have every trick up their sleeve. And with the wild card of coronavirus and people possibly staying home to avoid the virus, anything can happen. Anything can happen. Last thought. After seeing Donald Trump this week talk about how he has absolute power, he can tell governors what to do, he can demand and enforce that businesses be reopened. After seeing Trump's authoritarian slide this week, I am increasingly skeptical that Trump would leave peacefully if he loses to Biden. Now, I want to be really careful. I'm not saying Trump would succeed in not leaving if Biden wins. I just mean it won't be peaceful in that Trump will claim it was rigged. He will claim it was stolen. He will claim Joe Biden didn't really win. He may even try to start some kind of legal challenges. I do believe he will leave, but I am increasingly skeptical that Trump will leave what I would describe in a peaceful manner. I do believe he ultimately will leave. Let me know what you think about that. We're going to continue coverage of this issue and others on the David Pakman Show Instagram page. That's at David Pakman Show. Follow me at david.pakman on Instagram. Later today, I am going to phase 2 of my 2020 urban garden. I will be tracking and reporting all of it on my Instagram account at david.pakman. A nice break of levity from the coronavirus fiasco.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Louis Raven Wallace, author and creator of The View from Somewhere, a book and podcast about the myth of objectivity in journalism, also co-founder of Press On Southern Media Collective. Thanks for your time during these strange times, I guess I would say.
Yeah, of course.
So to begin with, I will sometimes get these beautiful emails from people in my audience who say, David, I love that you are not biased in your reporting. And while I will gladly accept any compliment, it concerns me a little bit from a media literacy perspective because I do an opinion program. I am not doing reporting, I'm doing commentary. And the program is very much biased in the sense that it is my opinion, and my opinion is certainly partisan. So can you start to talk about some of the categorization of media that needs to be done and that maybe not everybody is doing as well as they should?
Yeah, that's such a cool and weird anecdote that really sounds familiar to me, in that I think there's been this sort of bending of the concept of media bias over time to the point that, a lot of us think that biased media is just anything we don't like, right? Or don't agree with, or that doesn't vibe with us.
Yes.
And so a part of my sort of thesis has been to just get rid of this idea that media bias itself is the problem, and accept that all media in some way is biased, right? We have a frame, we have an ideology, we have a not necessarily a partisan political stance, but often that too, that we're bringing to anything that we produce as journalists. And so it's less about trying to be unbiased and more about doing a really rigorous investigation of what our own biases and perspectives are, and being transparent about those. And so it sounds like, the audience members you're hearing from, they trust you.
Yes.
And they might trust you in part because of that transparency. And so overall, that's a good thing. But I think an important sort of shift for us right now is to move away from this conflation of objectivity or nonpartisanship or being non-biased with being trustworthy. Because they are not inherently the same. And I think those concepts have become really muddled in a way that's actually really damaging.
Can you talk a little bit about objectivity versus neutrality, which is sometimes a source of confusion? And the way I've talked about it is I could be neutral on the issue of whether vaccines cause autism, or I could be objective, which is to transparently tell you that all the science tells us that they don't. And that's the way I try to explain it. But there's probably a better umbrella way to talk about that difference.
Yeah, sure. So, I am anti objectivity and neutrality, but I think that there is, again, a way in which those concepts have been conflated over time, where objectivity might be narrowly understood as sort of what you're talking about, rigorous kind of scientific approach to analyzing the facts in an honest attempt to reflect the closest version of truth that we can come up with, right? Yes. But more broadly, it's often been interpreted to also mean that the reporter or the outlet is neutral on the issue, or in some way impartial on the issue, or stands outside of it in some way. And that's been sort of the journalism school interpretation of objectivity as well for a long time, is that it's a reflection of neutrality. For me, I think even just the idea that there is one objective truth does kind of fall apart, philosophically at a certain point, and leaves us stuck with some of the same issues that neutrality does, of how can we ever fully stand outside of something and look at it objectively. And I don't think that that's possible. But I do think that rigor, transparency, being meticulous, being, striving for some version of the truth is something that journalists can and should still embrace, and that we do need to separate that out from some sort of performance of neutrality, a performance of impartiality that has been demanded of many journalists.
Yeah, the performative nature of neutrality is an interesting way to put it. And I think maybe to think about that a little bit, one can visualize the sort of corporate legacy media segments about, for example, climate change, where you have two guests, one of two, meaning 50% represents the scientific view, one of two, 50% represents some other view, right? China created it, it's a hoax or whatever. That is to me, that's performative neutrality in the sense that it's 50-50 in this very basic sense, but it does not reflect anything about what's actually happening out there in the scientific or factual community. Why has corporate media decided to do that? Is it as simple as avoiding criticism more from one political side than the other, or is there more to it?
So yes, avoiding criticism is one piece. I've heard people say that journalists, for all that we are willing to go after other people, are some of the most thin-skinned folks around, which is neither here nor there to me. But I think there are larger forces at play. That has always been true in this sort of performance of objectivity and neutrality, that it originated with a business model based on advertising. So advertisers wanted to appeal to the largest possible sort of general audience, but also often an audience that has money, that has resources, right? So that might have also translated or still translate to mean a white, upper middle class audience. And so sort of striking a balance of performed neutrality or performed impartiality that hits right at the middle of that target audience is a priority for advertisers and underwriters and sponsors. That certainly, TV news has taken extremely, extremely seriously this performance. But I also wouldn't underestimate, it's not pure economic forces. There are also political forces, in particular on the right, that have worked very hard for going on 5 decades now to sort of frame the concept of balance in terms of left, right, and then delineate a right-wing perspective that is actually very, very extreme as something normal and normative, and demand that that perspective be represented in quote-unquote balanced media. So the example that you gave about climate change, climate deniers are this tiny, tiny minority, right? Certainly in the scientific community, but also are a minority in the general populace in the United States. And so the demand that they always be represented in a conversation about climate change is a huge win for the sort of corporate right-wing media machine that has pushed to make that happen. And, this sort of performance of objectivity, performance of balance, and the demand of that is so dangerous in the hands of demagogues. And that's what we're dealing with now, right? Is journalists sitting around talking about whether or not to say that Donald Trump is lying because it might be perceived as partisan to say that he has lied, when he has lied. And, what could be more toxic to the cause of truth than that interpretation or that performance of objectivity? And to have journalists in mainstream newsrooms sitting around having that conversation, which they are, is such a huge win for far-right activists who want that to be the debate rather than the truth to be told, and then we debate the real issues from there.
Yeah, as a very brief aside, there's a great book, which may not even be in print anymore, called Waves of Rancor, which describes a lot of the backstory on how that was built up initially. But so you mentioned this question of, do we say that Donald Trump is lying or do we not? Recently, we've seen CNN doing some sort of live fact-checking graphically with notes at the bottom of the screen during the coronavirus press briefings. Can you talk a little bit about the effect that the mainstreaming of the term fake news as sort of as a cudgel has had on journalism and media?
Yeah, sure. So, the mainstreaming of the term fake news and Donald Trump's sort of use of it, as you said, as a cudgel, has been a powerful tool for advancing this sort of warping of the debate, and this demand that every discussion be balanced with both far-right ideology, or in some cases now just Donald Trump's ideas, whatever they may be. But that is part of a long-standing tradition, right, in the United States that has always been tied up with racism and white supremacy. And so the example that I give in my book is this idea of the lost cause in the Civil War. And so, the Civil War was, at least in part, about ending slavery. And slavery was a terror on the people who were enslaved, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you that. But almost immediately after the end of the Civil War, this sort of new story was written about who these white Southerners were who were fighting for the Confederacy and what they were about, and that they weren't about slavery or enslavement at all, but, they just wanted states' rights. And their lost war was this lost cause of states' rights that had nothing to do with racism. And in the late 1800s and early 1900s, activists for this sort of lost cause narrative demanded balance in textbooks, right? And demanded that schools, in favor of being less biased, actually teach this story that slavery had been this sort of benign thing, and that it wasn't really what the Civil War was about, and these nice white people just wanted their states' rights, and and they were nice to the black people anyway, and all this kind of BS, right? But that's like the original fake news, like this sort of, it's lost cause, and it's biased to teach it as something that was actually about racism. And so that strategy has been and used by racist demagogues in the United States since forever, and that's just one example of it. Donald Trump is part of a long tradition, and unfortunately has amassed a great deal of power, but he's not the first racist demagogue to amass a lot of power.
Certainly not. So in the limited time we have left, I would love to hear from you. What do you see as the lowest hanging fruit of, if we could start teaching media literacy in 7th grade, which I think would be a great time to start teaching it? 3 things I think would be really useful would be teaching, number 1, understand the primary purpose of a news source, which would very quickly get you to, well, if the primary purpose is to make money, that needs to be included in my analysis. Number 2, understanding whether you're looking at a primary source or not. And then number 3, distinguishing between opinion journalism and news journalism. That's like just an example, and there could be many other examples. What do you see, if you get a classroom of 12-year-olds in front of you, as the lowest hanging fruit that would do the most good as far as media literacy goes?
Those are great. I love your 3 points.
Okay.
I think that my big takeaway, not just for children, but for adults, and this is great if we can start them young, is just curiosity, right? That there's always another question, there's always follow-up. So I think we end up being fed this perception that what you read in the news or what you hear on the news is sort of, that's it. That's the final story. And the myth of objectivity feeds into that. There are these objective people out there who are journalists who just bring you the story, and that's everything that you might need to know. And either you trust them or you don't. But I think all of us right now really need to be working our muscle of curiosity and of always asking more questions and investigating further into things, and essentially sort of become journalists in a way ourselves. Certainly the crisis of COVID-19 and the pandemic has been an opportunity for that. People are seeing in real time how journalistic fact and truth actually isn't set in stone. It changes pretty quickly in an environment where even scientists don't know what this virus is, right? And so all of our ability to be curious and open-minded and to actually change the way that we think about something based on new information and ask new questions over time, to me, that's sort of the core for both people taking in media and for people producing it, is that we can all embody more of that curious journalist or curious scientist, and that a scientist or a journalist, the point of that person is not that they have the best answers, but that they have the best questions. And I think that's often misunderstood.
And process is important, right? Understanding that because something that was said about the virus 6 weeks ago ended up not being true doesn't mean someone was necessarily lying. It could mean that, but we are sort of iterating. Science is an iterative process, so is journalism, and understanding that, because that's also weaponized sometimes to say, hey,
right,
the thing they told us 6 weeks ago is wrong, therefore, Bill Gates is trying to, get a vaccine to sterilize people or whatever. It's all on the table because something was corrected. The process part seems so important.
Yeah, and understanding that process of investigation and inquisitiveness. And I think that's one of the most important things that we could be teaching in terms of media literacy, is that that's all that news is, right? Is the best attempt at providing facts and information of a group of people who brought it to you today.
We've been speaking with Louis Raven Wallace, author and creator of The View from Somewhere, a book and podcast about the myth of objectivity in journalism. So great having you on. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I'm pretty cynical by nature, but the last 2 months of seeing how, I don't know if it's 30% or 40% of the country has been dealing with coronavirus, it's really made me lose even more faith in humanity than I had already lost, at least American humanity. We already did a story on the bonus show about how 1/3 of the country believes coronavirus was created deliberately rather than evolving as viruses do. And this is already very, very bad. And we increasingly now have the sort of liberty crowd, the people that fetishize a myopic version of what freedom is, starting to protest that we must open the country. Many of them have even been gathering in large groups in order to demand that the country be opened. And one such rally happened in Michigan yesterday, another one happening, I believe today in Kentucky, possibly, but all of today's videos are from yesterday in Michigan. And Michigan's having a real problem with coronavirus. Michigan is in the top 8 states in cases per capita. Michigan is in the top 4 states in deaths per capita. And they're not doing that much testing. They're only testing 32nd per capita in the United States. And of course, many states simply do not have tests. It's beyond many states to be able to do more testing. The point is high death per capita, low testing per capita in Michigan. People have to stay the hell home. So here are protesters gathering in huge groups. Now you're going to hear, if you're not watching, I'll tell you some of what you're going to hear. You're going to hear screams of lock her up, referring to Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. You're going to hear screams of recall Whitmer. You'll hear USA, USA chants. And of course, what you will see if you're watching is a huge crowd of people when we're trying to fight a virus that spreads through droplet contagion. Take a look.
I thought I just felt a step. Recall Whitmer. Recall Whitmer. I thought I heard an American say, recall Whitmer. Did I hear an American say, recall Whitmer? What about George Orwell 1984? I see your sign. I see your sign.
Here are interviews with two people, one guy crying about being unable to get lawn fertilizer and a woman complaining about not being able to dye her gray roots, bending down to show how the roots are tragically coming in.
I can't go between those houses. You can't buy paint. You can't buy lawn fertilizer or grass seed or whatever. I mean, come on. All statewide? Really?
You know, it's time for our state to be opened up. We're tired of not being able to buy the things that we need, go to the hairdressers, get our hair done.
So, I mean, listen, the guy who's crying about fertilizer, if you're that desperate for some manure, just watch Trump's daily press briefings and you'll get more than your daily allotment. But this is really, really crazy. First of all, you know, the woman with the hair dye, 2,500 people died in the United States on Wednesday this week from coronavirus. This is the most in one day in any country since the start of the pandemic. She's complaining about dyeing her hair as the reason that the state needs to reopen. It also seems like these people aren't just either aware or telling the truth about what's going on in their states, because the guy, you know, crying about manure, I looked into it. Hardware stores are open in Michigan. They will give you fertilizer. They'll even bring it. You have to call ahead and give your credit card. They'll bring it out to your car. You can order it from Amazon. Amazon shipments are taking quite a while right now, but it'll get to you. The idea that, he's crying because he can't get fertilizer. You can get fertilizer. I don't know if he has access to the internet. So this is the epitome of the ugly side of America. And it is not lost on me that both of these individuals appear to be in higher risk groups based on their age, groups that should really be staying home right now, completely entitled, completely lacking an understanding of basic science. And they are indignant at others looking to help people and stay home. They're also wrong on the facts and confused about the world around them. So it's sort of like a perfect Trumpist. And I've said it before, I don't want anyone to die from this. But if they were only putting themselves at risk, I would say, okay, you know what? If people want to risk death and they're not endangering anyone else, let them do it. Like, how much are we going to fight them if they're only putting themselves at risk? Let it rip, so to speak. But they do put others at risk. People who do understand what's going on recognize that those people are putting at-risk people in a position where they may get the virus and die. Their actions don't only affect themselves, they affect everybody around them. So we have to act collectively here to keep people safe. They will never change their minds until they and their loved ones get sick. And by then it's going to be too late. They'll have spread it already. Most will still vote for Trump in November regardless. Remember when Trump said his Vietnam was avoiding STDs during like the 1980s or something like that? For these people, not dyeing their hair as a sacrifice, as tens of thousands of people are dying and healthcare workers are in warlike conditions every day, they are considering this a big battle for them. And I get it. I'm sick of being home. I want to see people. I want to go out. I just want to sit in a restaurant for a couple of hours. I totally understand it. But this is bigger than any one of us. And particularly for a lot of these folks who are religious and tend to subscribe to the idea that there's something bigger than them that connects to their actions every single day. How is it that they don't get that same idea applies in a real way to what we're doing here in trying to stop the spread? It's disheartening, it's concerning, it's disappointing. And unfortunately, they're not only putting themselves at risk. If it were only risking their own lives, at a certain point, I would say, go ahead and do it. But that's not the situation. Let's talk about vaccination a little bit. We're going to cover vaccination in more detail on an upcoming program as it relates to the virus. But today I want to talk about two prominent Trumpist sycophants who have announced that they will not accept any coronavirus vaccine that is associated in any way with Bill Gates. Now, for me, this entire narrative about, the benevolent billionaires versus the evil billionaires, it's a pretty silly one. I apply a more structural understanding to this issue of billionaires and the sociology and the economics of billionaires. I believe most billionaires as people are pretty good people, but there are systemic components in our society that favor the very rich, which often lead to unproductive, self-centered behavior on the part of billionaires and huge corporations. So, during the Bernie campaign, there was a lot of discussion about why does this candidate or that candidate hate billionaires? And every candidate addressed it differently. But my view has always been, this is not about billionaires as people. It's about the positioning of billionaires and policy in a society that at a structural level allows and encourages certain behaviors where you see billionaires created. And that's really the crux of what we're trying to deal with. So my point is, talking about these are the good billionaires and these are the bad billionaires seems like a pretty fraught experiment to me. That being said, when you look at Bill Gates as an individual versus, Koch brothers as individuals, and you look at what Bill Gates has funded versus the things that Koch brothers have funded. In addition, I get Koch brothers fund medicine and some good things as well. You look at Bill and Melinda Gates, they have lobbied other billionaires to give away as much of their wealth as possible. Bill Gates has dedicated himself for a very long time to funding and finding cures and solutions to everything from sanitation in developing nations, vaccines for pandemics, etc. Yeah, Bill Gates doesn't want to pay a wealth tax. He's a billionaire. When Elizabeth Warren put out her wealth tax proposal, he said he scoffed at it. He balked at it, right? But if we had more billionaires like Bill Gates than the Koch brothers, we would be better off, all else being equal. So this gets us now to coronavirus. The Gates Foundation is funding development, research, and possible factories where 7 different coronavirus vaccines could be produced. Now, this is a huge waste of money in a literal sense. And what I mean by that is, in order to have capacity to produce enough vaccines to really distribute them to enough people to build herd immunity, you have to take a chance on an unproven vaccine. You have to start building infrastructure to produce unproven vaccines. There are 7 promising vaccine candidates right now for coronavirus. Bill Gates is already funding factories to produce 7 different vaccines. In all likelihood, 6 of those 7 will not end up being the vaccine, okay? That's a really good thing that he is doing. And his mere involvement in vaccination is causing conspiracy theory explosions. A girl I went to high school with has been posting a lot of this stuff on her Facebook page. She's a big Trumpist. I had to unfollow her. Donald Trump's friends, Diamond and Silk, are spreading the same disinformation. Take a look at this, including conspiracies about Bill Gates and population control and other such nonsense.
We do need to look at the community.
Right.
But what we don't need to happen is what happened with Africa. When Bill Gates and them took that vaccine to Africa, trying to vaccinate, they felt like stuff can start right there in certain parts of Africa. That's what we don't need to. You're not going to make black people the guinea pig for this here right here.
We're not going to be your experiment.
Nope.
Or your project. Not black
Yes.
folks.
Today, Billy, yes. The Surgeon General was talking too. As a matter of fact, he was trending today. Listen, I tell us what we need to know.
Yeah.
But I always look at the underbelly of what's going on. That's
right.
the intuition in me.
Yes.
That's my intuitive counterpart.
Yes.
What are you about to do here?
Right.
Because what you're not going to do, you're not going to start vaccinating black folks.
Right. And saying we have to have a vaccination card just to go to work.
So you're not going to do that. And what it does is it'll start with us first.
Right.
See, they got us with slavery. They got us with Jim Crow. Now they about to push this here mass vaccination. And listen, kudos if you make your vaccines for people and you want to help people. But I have a problem receiving any vaccine from any entity, especially anybody like Bill Gates, who pushed for population control.
That's
the
right.
same thing that Margaret Sanger pushed for.
Abortions. Genocide.
Imagine comparing Jim Crow to a coronavirus vaccine. Again, as I've said before, if people were only endangering themselves, I would be much more resigned to a sort of Darwinism, in a sense, a sort of Darwinistic perspective when it comes to what these people are saying and doing. But Diamond and Silk have an audience, and they post stuff, and people see it, and it starts to spread like a virus itself. Bill Gates, population control, bad for black people, don't accept any vaccine that Bill Gates is associated with. As it is, we are going to have trouble actually getting the vaccine to everybody, both because of supply issues and because of existing anti-vaxxer sentiment. And now this on top of it. So it's much like with the virus. If you don't social distance, you're putting other people at risk. If you convince people not to get the vaccine, the risk of spread grows exponentially and our ability to achieve herd immunity is diminished. If you don't get vaccinated, you are putting other people at risk. And as we've seen with the measles anti-vaxxers, when you convince more people not to get a vaccine, you actually create pockets of outbreaks, which is exactly what's been happening with measles. So this is stunningly ignorant, but dangerous ignorance in the modern United States of 2020 is unfortunately common, and it's incredibly applauded in some sick circles. Donald Trump Jr. and Donald Trump himself will often retweet Diamond and Silk. They've been to the White House meeting with Trump. Like, this is really, I know I use the term weaponized too much, so I'm not going to use it, but we are in an acute idiocracy, and the calls are coming from inside the house, so to speak. Scary, scary stuff. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here is a voicemail criticizing me for a big faux pas I made when talking about my urban garden on stream yesterday. Take a listen to this.
Hello, David. I saw your show today, and I love your show. You said today that you were getting some, you had your raised beds built and you were bringing in some dirt.
Yes.
And then you wondered if you should call it soil. Dirt is what you wash off of your hands, and soil is a live medium just waiting to grow your vegetables.
Got it.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I clearly am a beta male gardener. I don't pretend to be an expert in gardening. And when I said that I was having dirt delivered to grow vegetables, my instinct was that wasn't the right term. And indeed it is not. I am having a beautiful soil delivery this weekend. I'm going to plant, I'm going to, much in the style of Howard Dean, we're going to plant carrots, and we're going to plant peppers, and we're going to plant tomatoes, and we're going all the way to the fall, woo, with vegetables. So follow the adventure on Instagram at david.pakman. The planting starts very soon. The soil is imminently going to be delivered, and it's going to be very, very exciting. And it is just something not related to the virus, which I think we all desperately need right now. Don't miss today's bonus show. Get instant access to it by being a member or a patron. I'll talk to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.